The engagement party was in 3 hours, and Mia Russo had no fiancé. This was objectively her own fault. She had told her family 11 months ago, at her cousin Daniela's wedding, standing in the reception hall with a glass of Prosecco, and the particular loosened honesty that open bars and family pressure produced in combination, that she was engaged. She had not been engaged. She had been 3 weeks out of a relationship with a man named Patrick, who had decided, after 14 months, that he was not, as he put it, a settling down kind of person, which Mia had translated accurately as he had met someone else, and found the other person's existence easier to disclose through implication than direct statement. She had been standing in the reception hall watching Daniela dance with her new husband, watching her mother watch her with the specific expression that Italian mothers of unmarried 30-year-old daughters had been perfecting since the Renaissance. And she had said, into the middle of a silence that had stretched one beat too long, "Actually, I have news too." 11 months. She had sustained it for 11 months, with the particular commitment of someone who had started a lie small and then watched it accumulate its own weight. Yes, his name is Marco. No, you haven't met him, he travels for work. The photos she had deflected. The dinners she had avoided. The Christmas call where her grandmother had said bring him for Easter, and Mia had said, of course, absolutely, we'd love that, and then spent 3 months hoping something would intervene. Nothing had intervened. Easter had become a birthday dinner, had become a summer gathering, had become, through the inexorable logic of family events, a formal engagement party that her mother had organized with the thoroughness of a military campaign, booked a private room at Rosario's, invited 47 people, ordered a cake. Mia was standing outside Rosario's now, 47 minutes before the party began, in a dress she had bought specifically for an occasion she had invented, holding her phone with a list of 11 contacts she had called in the past 2 weeks, all of whom had declined or been unreachable or had said yes and then sent a cancellation text this morning, including her friend Theo, who had agreed last Tuesday and this morning had texted a single-word appendix, which she had verified was genuine, because Theo was not creative enough to invent organ failure on short notice. She needed a fiancé. She needed one in 46 minutes. She needed someone tall enough that her mother would approve on sight, composed enough to hold a conversation with 47 people asking questions, and either brave enough or uninformed enough to walk into a room full of Russos and pretend to be in love with a woman he had never met. She looked at her phone. She looked at the street. She looked at her phone again. The cafe across the street was called Minerva, and it had outdoor seating that was technically inadvisable for March, but which 3 people were using anyway with the stubborn optimism of city people who had been inside for a long winter. One of those people was a man sitting alone with a coffee and a newspaper, which was unusual enough in itself, newspapers being an artifact that Mia associated with a previous generation's commute, but what made her notice him was the stillness. He was reading, actually reading, not scrolling, not glancing up at his phone between paragraphs, just reading, with the complete undivided attention of someone who had made a decision about what they were doing and was doing it entirely. He was, objectively, exactly the right height. Dark coat. Dark hair. The kind of face that her mother would describe as serious, which in her mother's vocabulary was the highest available compliment for a man who was not yet family. Mia looked at her phone. Looked at the man. Looked at her phone. She crossed the street. She stood beside his table. He looked up without startling, the unhurried look-up of someone who had registered her approach before she arrived and was simply waiting for her to speak. "I need to ask you something," she said. And then, because she had always found that directness survived better under pressure than preamble, she told him all of it. The Prosecco and the lie, and the 11 months, and the 47 guests and the cake, and Theo's appendix. She told it in under 2 minutes, because she had been rehearsing it in her head for 3 weeks, and the version in her head had become very efficient. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not change his expression in any of the ways she had anticipated, not the confusion, Not the amusement at her expense, not the polite alarm of someone about to excuse himself from an uncomfortable situation. He simply listened, with the same quality of attention he had been giving the newspaper, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's his name?" "Marco," she said. He nodded once. "Occupation," she blinked. She had not expected logistics. She had expected refusal. "International consulting," she said, because it was the answer she had given her mother, and she was committed to consistency. "How long have we been together?" 14 months, she said. I said 14 months. He folded the newspaper. He picked up his coffee and finished it in a single calm motion and set the cup down. He stood. He was, she confirmed, exactly the right height. He looked at her steadily with dark eyes that were doing something she could not quite categorize, reading her in a way that felt less like assessment and more like comprehension. Then, he said, "All right." Just like that. No negotiation. No questions about what was in it for him. No theatrical hesitation. All right. As if she had asked him to pass the salt. She stared at him. "You don't want to know anything else," she said. "I know enough," he said. "You need someone for one evening. You're in trouble of your own making, and you're asking a stranger for help because you've run out of other options, and you're not willing to let 47 people, including your mother, sit in a room, waiting for someone who isn't coming." He looked at her. "That tells me enough." She stood on the March pavement outside Minerva Cafe, staring at a man whose name she did not know, who had just agreed to pretend to be her fiancé in front of 47 members of her family. "What's your name?" she said. "Luca," he said. "I'm Mia." "I know," he said. "You told me." She had. She had told him her name in the first 30 seconds of her explanation. He had been paying attention. She thought, briefly, that she should be more alarmed by how easy this had been. She thought, more practically, that she had 39 minutes, and a man named Luca with a folded newspaper, and a finished coffee, and the most complete composure she had ever encountered in a stranger, and that these were the available materials, and she had always been good at working with what she had. "All right," she said. "I'll brief you on the way." He gestured toward Rosario's. "After you." She briefed him on the pavement in front of Rosario's with the focused efficiency of someone running a pre-shift handover, the essential facts delivered in order of importance. Her parents were Giulia and Roberto Russo, married 34 years, her father more relaxed than her mother. Her mother would ask the most questions, and the questions would be specific. Her grandmother, Nonna Clara, was 81 and sharp as a tax auditor, and should be treated as the most important person in the room, because she was. Her cousin Daniela, whose wedding had started all of this, would be sympathetic but curious. The remaining 39 or so guests were aunts and uncles and family friends and neighbors from the street where she had grown up, and they would be warm, but they would also talk to each other afterward, and anything inconsistent would circulate. Luca listened. He asked 2 questions. First, whether there was a proposal story. She had one. She had constructed it months ago in case she needed it. Marco had proposed at the restaurant where they had their first date. Simple, flowers, no audience. She had cried. He nodded. Second, whether any of the family spoke to each other through the week or whether the party was the primary point of contact. She said her mother and her Aunt Rosa spoke every day. He nodded again, filed it, moved on. She had been watching him absorb information the way she watched competent people absorb information, noting what they prioritized and how they organized it, and what she noticed was that he did not appear to be performing comprehension. He was actually comprehending, quickly and without apparent effort, the way people did when they were genuinely intelligent and not interested in demonstrating the intelligence, only in using it. She also noticed, with the part of her brain that continued operating independently of crisis management, that he was considerably better looking than she had registered from across the street. Not in a way that announced itself, not the manufactured attractiveness, of someone who had assembled a presentation, but in the way of someone whose face had been arranged by nature with a degree of intention that most faces didn't receive. Strong jaw. Dark eyes that were doing the reading thing continuously. Not intrusively, but consistently. And a composure. Always the composure, which was the quality she kept returning to because she was about to walk into a room of 47 people who loved her and who were going to ask him questions, and the composure was the thing that made this survivable. "You seem very calm," she said as a neutral observation. "I'm calm," he confirmed. "You're not nervous at all." He considered this. "No, you're about to meet my entire family and tell them you're in love with me and you've never met me before tonight." He looked at her with a directness that was beginning to feel like his default mode, steady and uncalculated. "People are generally predictable," he said, "even in groups. You ask them questions about themselves and you listen to the answers and they tell you everything you need." He paused. "Your family loves you. That means they want to like me. That's the most useful possible starting condition." She looked at him for a moment. She thought, this is either the most socially intelligent person I have ever met, or something else entirely that I don't have a framework for yet. She decided to examine this later. "Ready?" she said. He offered her his arm, which was another old-fashioned gesture she had not expected, and she took it because there were windows at the front of Rosario's, and her mother had almost certainly been watching the street for the past 20 minutes. Her mother met them at the door. Giulia Russo was 62 years old, and had the particular quality of Italian women of a certain generation who had decided that every element of their appearance in their home and their family's occasions would reflect the full weight of their attention, which meant she was immaculately dressed, and the room behind her was immaculately arranged, and her expression when she saw Luca was the expression of a woman doing a rapid and comprehensive assessment. "Mama," Mia said. "This is Marco." Luca did not miss a beat. He extended his hand and said, "Signora Russo," with an accent on the title that was exactly correct. Not performative, but natural. The Italian of someone who had learned it somewhere. It was actually spoken. Her mother's hand went into his, and her eyebrows went up fractionally. And she said, in Italian, "You speak our language." "A little," he said, also in Italian, and smiled, and it was the smile of someone who knew exactly what a little meant in this context, and was choosing it deliberately. Her mother said, "Come in, come in," with the warmth she reserved for people who had passed an initial threshold, and they went inside. The room was full of flowers and fairy lights, and the noise of 47 people who had been waiting and were now redirecting their collective attention toward the entrance. Mia felt the familiar anxiety of being looked at by everyone who loved her while carrying a secret they didn't know was a secret. And then she felt Luca's hand cover hers, where it rested in the crook of his arm, a brief, steady pressure, and the anxiety did not disappear, but it settled to a manageable register. She looked at him. He was looking at the room with the calm assessment of someone making a plan, identifying the geography, locating the relevant people. "Nonna Clara," Mia said quietly, nodding toward the corner where her grandmother sat in the armchair that had been placed there specifically for her. Because Nonna Clara sat wherever she decided to sit, and the rest of the room arranged itself accordingly. He looked. He nodded once. They crossed the room, and Mia watched Luca look at her grandmother the way she looked at patients whose chart she was reading for the first time, with genuine focus, not the polished courtesy of someone performing respect. He sat beside her without waiting to be invited, which Mia nearly stopped him from doing before she realized that Nonna Clara had watched him do it and had not produced the expression that preceded her more pointed observations. Nonna Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You have patient eyes," she said, in Italian. He smiled. "You have accurate ones," he said. Her grandmother's expression shifted into the specific configuration that Mia had seen exactly 3 times in her life. the configuration that meant she was deciding she approved of someone. This had previously been achieved by her father, by Daniela's husband, and by the priest at her childhood church, who had once arrived with food during a difficult winter without being asked. Mia stood beside them and thought, somehow, against all probability, this might actually work. It worked. She did not understand how, entirely. She understood the individual components, the quality of his attention, the Italian deployed at the right moments, the way he answered questions about their relationship with the specificity of someone who had been there, rather than the vagueness of someone constructing a history on the fly. He used her name, naturally. He touched her hand or her elbow at the moments. A man who loved someone would, not too often, not with the deliberate performance of someone hitting marks, but with the quiet ease of someone for whom proximity to her was ordinary. Her father Roberto found him within the first 20 minutes. Her father was a man who had spent 34 years being the reasonable counterweight to her mother's thoroughness, which had produced in him a quality of easy warmth combined with a single sharp instinct for the one question that cut to what he actually wanted to know. He asked Luca 3 questions. First, what do you do? Luca said consulting, international, primarily long-term strategy, which was vague enough to be consistent with what Mia had told people, and specific enough to sound like an actual answer. Second, what do you think of my daughter? Luca said without pause that she was the most practically courageous person he had met, and that she solved problems with a directness that most people spent years learning, and she appeared to have arrived with. Her father had looked at Mia with the expression that said he was reassessing something in a positive direction, and then had looked back at Luca with an expression that said the reassessment was complete, and he had decided. Third question, do you want a drink? Yes, Luca said, and her father put a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the bar, and Mia stood alone for a moment, processing the fact that her invented fiancé had just been absorbed into the family with the frictionless ease of someone who had always been heading there. Daniela found her during this moment. Daniela was 29 and had been married for 11 months and had the specific luminosity of someone who was genuinely happy with the large choice they had made, and she put her arm through Mia's and said, quietly, into her ear, "Where did you find him?" "Across the street," Mia said, which was so true that she almost laughed. "He's extraordinary," Daniela said. "The way he looked at you when you were talking to Zia Rosa. You weren't even looking at him, and he was just watching you. Like you were the interesting thing in the room." Mia looked across to where Luca was standing with her father and her uncle Filippo, holding a glass of red wine, saying something that made her uncle laugh. He was not looking at her. She watched him anyway. She thought about what Daniela had said. The way he looked at you, like you, were the interesting thing in the room. She filed this and moved on because there were people to greet and a party to survive, and she did not have the capacity to examine it closely while simultaneously performing a happiness she had invented. The party moved through its stages. The toast her father gave was warm and slightly embarrassing in the particular way of toasts given by fathers who were genuinely pleased, referencing Mia's stubbornness in terms that were affectionate but accurate. Luca stood beside her during it, with his hand at the small of her back, and when her father said Marco has been patient enough to win her trust, which is the hardest thing she gives, Luca said quietly into her ear, without any particular emphasis, "He's right. You know." She looked at him. He was looking at her father. His expression was the reading expression, the comprehension expression, the one that was not performing, but simply receiving. "You've known me 4 hours," she said quietly. He turned to look at her. The dark eyes were steady and close, and the composure was still there, but it was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. It was letting something else through. Something quieter and more direct. "Long enough," he said. The cake was brought out at 9 o'clock. White with pale gold flowers, her mother's taste translated by the bakery on Savona Street, with their usual accuracy. Everyone gathered. Her father put his arm around her mother, and her mother's expression had the fullness of someone whose careful work had produced the occasion she intended. Nana Clara sat in her armchair and watched everything with the attention of someone who had lived long enough to understand that gatherings like this one were the actual substance of life, and that the years between them were the scaffolding. Mia stood beside Luca with a piece of cake she wasn't eating, watching her family, and felt the particular complicated sadness of someone who had received exactly what they'd arranged for under false pretenses. This was the party she had wanted her mother to be able to give. This was the occasion that made her mother's expression look like that, and the center of it was a lie she had constructed, and a stranger she had recruited from a cafe across the street 3 hours ago. She should feel relieved that it had worked. She felt, instead, something more uncomfortable. At 10:30, the party began to wind down with the gentle inevitability of family occasions that had achieved their purpose. Coats were retrieved. Cheeks were kissed. Her grandmother took Luca's hand when she stood from her armchair, and he offered his arm for her to steady herself on, and Nana Clara looked up at him and said something in a quiet Italian that Mia couldn't quite catch. She asked him later, on the pavement outside Rosario's, what her grandmother had said. Luca was quiet for a moment. She said, "Don't waste this one." Mia stood on the March pavement in the cold and looked at him. She said, meaning me. He looked at her steadily. "I think she meant both of us," he said. The street was quiet around them. The party sounds had receded back inside the restaurant. A taxi went past, throwing light across the pavement briefly, and then it was dark again. She had the prescription slip in her bag. She had the $41. She had an evening that had worked beyond any reasonable expectation. She had a stranger beside her who had walked into a room of 47 people who loved her and had treated them with a genuineness she had not asked for and could not entirely explain. She said, "I don't know your last name." "Cavallo," he said. "Luca Cavallo," she said. He nodded. She said, "I owe you something. For tonight." He looked at her with the reading expression. "No," he said. "You don't. You gave up your evening." "I gave up a newspaper," he said, "and a cold coffee." He paused. Neither was particularly irreplaceable. She almost smiled. She was very tired and slightly overwhelmed and standing on a cold pavement, and she almost smiled. "Can I at least buy you dinner?" she said, "a real one, to say thank you." He was quiet for a moment. In the way she was beginning to understand was not hesitation, but consideration, the specific pause of someone who was deciding something with actual care. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She put out her hand. He shook it. The handshake was firm and brief and normal in every way, which was somehow stranger than the entire evening had been, the return to an ordinary register after 4 hours of extraordinary pretense. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table, in her engagement party dress, at 11:15 at night, and stared at the middle distance for a long time. She thought about a man who had folded a newspaper and stood up and said all right. She thought about her grandmother's hand on his arm. She thought about, don't waste this one. She did not know what to do with any of it yet, but she thought she would find out. She met him for dinner the following Saturday at a restaurant she had chosen herself, mid-range and good, the kind of place she went when she wanted actual food rather than an occasion. A narrow room on a side street with mismatched chairs, and a menu that changed weekly, and the particular comfortable noise level of somewhere that was full without being loud. She had spent the week between in the ordinary run of her life, which was considerable enough that it did not leave much space for extended contemplation. She worked as a project manager for an architecture firm that was currently running 4 simultaneous builds in different stages of completion, which meant her days were a sequential series of problems to solve and people to coordinate, and decisions that needed to be made by someone. And she was the someone. She was good at it. She was good at it in the specific way of people who had been problem-solving since before they had words for it, and the work absorbed her in the way that suited her temperament, completely during the hours she was doing it. In the spaces between, she thought about him, not with the anxious repetition of someone who had caught a feeling they weren't prepared for, more with the quality of attention she gave to things that didn't add up, the specific curiosity of someone whose professional life was built on understanding how pieces fit together. He didn't add up in ways she kept returning to. A man who read physical newspapers in March. A man who said all right to a stranger's impossible request without negotiating. A man who had absorbed 47 members of her family in an evening and emerged from it having been specifically endorsed by Nana Clara, who had declined to endorse her own nephew's second wife and 3 separate local politicians. She arrived at the restaurant first and was seated and had reviewed the menu once when he came in. She watched him cross the room toward her and noted again the quality she had registered outside the cafe, the wrongness of his composure in ordinary settings, the sense of someone whose stillness was a choice rather than a temperament, and she thought, this is a person with a history I don't have access to yet. He sat. He looked at her. How was your week? She said. Productive, he said. Yours? Complicated, she said. 4 builds in progress. 1 contractor behind schedule. 1 client who is reconsidering a structural decision they approved 6 months ago. He picked up the menu. What happens if the structural decision changes? We lose 3 weeks, and I have a series of conversations I would prefer to have in a different sequence, she said. He nodded. What would you do instead? She told him, briefly, the actual strategy she had been developing for 2 days. The sequence of conversations that might salvage the timeline if she started them in the right order with the right framing. He listened with the complete attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened, and when she finished, he asked 1 question that was so precisely aimed at the 1 variable she had not fully resolved that she looked at him directly for a moment before answering. You know construction, she said. Some, he said, in the way he had said a little about the Italian, which she was beginning to understand was his way of acknowledging more than the minimum while not claiming more than was accurate. She asked him about his work. He described it in the same way he described most things, accurately and without excess. He worked in asset management, long-term strategy, primarily for private clients with significant holdings. He had done this for a long time. He worked independently, with a small team. He traveled when it was required and otherwise preferred to stay in one place. Where do you stay? She said. Here, mostly. He named the part of the city. A neighborhood she knew. Old buildings. Quiet streets. The kind of area that attracted people who valued permanence over visibility. She thought about a man reading a physical newspaper on an outdoor calf chair in March, and it fitting, now with the neighborhood he had named. Why did you say yes, she said. Last Saturday. She had been waiting for the right moment to ask it directly, and the dinner had arrived, and they were in a comfortable register, and this felt like the moment. He was quiet for a beat. The considering pause. You asked clearly, he said. You explained the situation without embellishment and without trying to make it sound better than it was. He paused. People who ask for help honestly deserve more of it than they usually receive. She looked at him. That's a principle, she said. Yes, he said. You apply it generally. When I can, he said. She thought about this. She thought about what it meant to have a principle like that and apply it to a stranger on a pavement outside a cafe and walk into a room of 47 people on the basis of it. You could have said no. She said, easily. Yes, he said. He met her eyes steadily. I didn't want to. She sat with that. The restaurant moved around them with its comfortable noise, and the food arrived and she ate and he ate, and they talked about other things, her work and his, and the building across from the cafe where she had found him that had been a textile factory in a previous century and was now apartments, and she had not previously particularly thought about the building, but his knowledge of it was specific and interested, and she found herself interested too, in the way that people became interested in things when the person describing them was genuinely engaged. At the end of the evening, he walked her to the corner where she caught her bus, and they stood on the pavement in the March cold, familiar in its specific temperature now, and she thought about the previous Saturday on a different pavement and how much had accumulated in a week. "I'd like to see you again," he said. She looked at him. "Just to be clear," she said, "you understand this doesn't require a performance. My family is not here." He looked back at her with the dark, steady eyes. "I know that," he said. She thought about what that meant. That he wanted to see her again not because there was a room to perform in, but because he wanted to see her again. She thought about the single question he had asked about her work problem, the one aimed precisely at the unresolved variable. She thought about patient eyes, and "Don't waste this one." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. And then, because he was who he was, he did not press for a specific plan or a time or a confirmation of what yes meant. He simply accepted it, as he accepted most things, as the complete and sufficient answer that it was. She got on her bus. She rode home through the city. She sat by the window and watched the streets go past, and thought about a man who had given up a cold coffee and said all right, and then, across 2 evenings, had become the most interesting person she had met in a very long time. She was going to have to tell him eventually. She understood that. Whatever this was becoming, it had a lie at its foundation, a small theatrical lie that 47 people believed, and that she would eventually have to address if this continued. She thought about that, and then she thought about the fact that she was already thinking about it as a when rather than an if. She thought, "I should probably be more careful." She thought, "I have always been very careful, and look at the available evidence for how that's gone." She looked out at the city, going past. She thought, yes was the right answer. They fell into each other's company the way 2 people fell into each other's company when both of them were, by nature, deliberate about their time, and had decided independently that the other person was worth being deliberate about. Not urgently, not with the rushed, breathless quality of people afraid that the feeling would expire if they didn't act quickly enough, but consistently, with the specific consistency of 2 people building something together without announcing what they were building. They had dinner on Saturdays. This became, without either of them formally establishing it, the structure of their weeks, the point toward which the rest of the working days oriented themselves. Sometimes they ate at her restaurant, the narrow place with mismatched chairs. Sometimes at other places she knew or he found, always chosen for the food rather than the occasion. They talked for a long time at every dinner. She had not had conversations of that quality in years, the kind that moved across subjects with the ease of 2 people who were both interested in things and not afraid to admit to not knowing, the kind where 2 hours passed and felt like 40 minutes. She learned things about him gradually. He had grown up between 2 cities, spending parts of his childhood in each, which accounted for the quality of his Italian and the equally natural way he moved in English. He had an older brother he was not close to, for reasons he described simply as different values, without bitterness. He had studied history before he understood that what he actually wanted was to apply its patterns to present problems, which was how he had arrived at the kind of strategy work he now did. He had been in a serious relationship 7 years ago that had ended badly in the specific way that relationships ending badly when one person had outgrown the shape of the thing they were in. He asked her things too, with the same quality of focused attention, about her work and what she had wanted to do before she arrived at project management, and whether it was the thing she had aimed at or the thing she had discovered she was good at and followed. About her family and what it had been like to be the quieter one. She told him this: the one who managed and organized while Daniela was the one who was easy to love at first sight. He asked her about this specifically, and she found herself answering more honestly than she intended, saying that she had spent a long time being the competent one, and that competence was respected, but that being respected and being known were different things, and she had not always been sure people got far enough past the competence to find anything else. He was quiet for a moment after that. "I got past it in about 10 minutes, he said. She looked at him. "The outdoor calf," she said. He nodded. "The way you told me the situation, the clarity of it, the lack of self-pity." He paused. "And the fact that you apologized to me while you were asking me for help, which meant you were managing my feelings at the same time you were managing a crisis, which is the specific habit of someone who has been doing that for a very long time." She sat with this. She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately by someone who had known her for 11 minutes. She also knew, sitting across from him at dinner on a Tuesday in April, that she was going to have to tell him the truth. The dinner on Tuesday had happened because they had talked on Saturday until the restaurant closed and agreed spontaneously to continue the following week, and the truth that had a lie in it was sitting between them with an increasing weight that she felt every time he spoke about the party with any naturalness, which he did occasionally, mentioning something her father had said or asking how Daniela was. She told him on the third Tuesday. It came out differently than she had prepared it, less organized, more honest in its disorder. She told him that Marco didn't exist, that she had invented him at a wedding under Prosecco and family pressure, and sustained the invention for 11 months because she had not found a graceful exit, and then the party had materialized, and she had been standing outside Rosario's with 47 people inside, and a genuine appendix across town, and she had seen him with his newspaper, and she had crossed the street. He listened the entire time without interrupting. When she finished, the table was quiet. She sat in the quiet and thought, this is the moment it ends. This was always going to be the moment it ended. She had built something genuine on top of something fabricated, and she had known the reckoning would come, and here it was. He said, "I know." She looked at him. "I know Marco isn't real," he said. "I knew before you walked back across the street." She stared at him. "How?" He was quiet for a moment. "I heard you," he said. "On the phone. Before you came over. You were standing on the pavement, and you were going through your contacts one by one, and I could hear the calls going to voicemail, and I could see you working through what to do next." She put her hands flat on the table. "You let me tell you the whole story." "Yes," he said. "You agreed knowing it was invented." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She felt something that was not quite anger and not quite relief, and was perhaps the specific feeling of someone who has been caught in something by someone who has also been caught in something. "Why?" she said. He met her eyes directly. "Because you needed help, and the help was real even if the situation wasn't." He paused. "And because I was curious about you." He said this with the simplicity of someone stating a fact. "I wanted to see what you were like." He paused again. "I still do." She sat across from him and thought about a man who had heard her making desperate phone calls and had folded his newspaper and waited and let her tell him a story he already knew and then said all right, and had walked into a room of 47 people and treated each of them as though they mattered, and had told Nana Clara she had accurate eyes, and had walked her to the bus corner and said, "I'd like to see you again," and had come to dinner on Saturdays and Tuesdays. She thought about patient eyes and long enough, and I didn't want to. The truth sat on the table between them, finally, all of it. She said, "What do we do now?" He said, "What we've been doing, if you want to." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, and something shifted in his expression, something that had been steady and composed, and was now steady and composed, and also, quietly, warm. The problem with her family was that they believed in Marco. This was the problem she had created, and it was, she understood with the clarity of someone who had been avoiding thinking about it directly, a problem with several possible solutions, none of which were comfortable, and one of which was the solution she was currently pursuing, which was to allow Luca to continue being Marco in all family contexts until she had worked out how to address the gap between the two. She had told him this. He had nodded as if it were a reasonable operational constraint rather than a significant ethical complication, and said, "When you're ready," and had not raised it again. This was either a virtue or something she needed to examine, and she had decided it was a virtue for now, and would examine it when the rest of the pieces were in a more stable configuration. Her mother called on the first Sunday of every month. These calls were 45 minutes minimum, and covered, in order, her mother's week, her Aunt Rosa's situation, which was a permanent ongoing installment drama, the state of various cousins' lives and choices, and Mia. The Mia section always included Marco. How is Marco? When is Marco coming to dinner? Daniela's husband was already coming to Sunday lunch twice a month, her mother mentioned, which was not a comparison. She was very careful to present it not as a comparison. Mia told her mother that Marco traveled a great deal, that his schedule was unpredictable, that she would arrange something when she could. She managed the conversation the way she managed her work problems, by identifying the variable that most needed addressing and redirecting around it. She was good at this. She had been good at it for 11 months, and she was going to need to continue being good at it for however long it took her to find the version of the truth that she could actually deliver. She was thinking about this on a Saturday afternoon in May, when she was at Luca's apartment for the first time. This had happened through the natural accumulation of evenings, arriving at the point where it felt more natural to continue a conversation in his space than to end it at the corner. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of one of the old buildings in his neighborhood, the ones that had been there since before the city's current version of itself, and it was not what she had expected, which she recognized meant she had been forming expectations from insufficient data. It was full of books. Not decoratively, not the assembled spines of someone who had bought books for their visual effect, but the genuine accumulation of a person for whom reading was structural rather than supplemental. Books in shelves that covered most of the available wall space, and on tables, and in 2 stacks on the floor beside a reading chair that had the specific worn quality of something used daily for years. There were maps on one wall, old ones, framed without the self-consciousness of someone making a design choice. More the accumulation of someone who had needed them at some point, and had not seen a reason to take them down. She moved through the space with the professional attention she gave to any built environment, and thought about the person it described. Permanence, accumulation over time rather than curation. The absence of anything disposable or recently acquired. The quality of a space that had been inhabited rather than decorated. "These are old," she said, in front of a set of maps she was examining. "Yes," he said, from the kitchen where he was making coffee. "How old?" she said. He came to look at them beside her. "The one on the left is about 400 years old," he said. "Give or take." She turned to look at him. "You have a 400-year-old map on your wall." "Several," he said, the same quality of plainness he brought to all factual statements. She looked at the map again. The geography was familiar and strange simultaneously, the shapes of known places rendered in the cartographic conventions of a different century, the coastlines slightly wrong, in ways that were the wrongness of incomplete information rather than invention. "Where did you get them?" she said. He was quiet for a beat. "Collected," he said over time. She looked at him. He was looking at the maps with the expression that was not quite the reading expression, and not quite the composure expression. Something between them, something she didn't have a category for yet. She thought about the apartment and what it described, and she thought about the thing that had been sitting at the back of her understanding of him since the donation center outside Rosario's. The quality of wrongness, the sense of someone in the wrong context, for reasons she had not been able to identify. She thought about a man who read physical newspapers, who spoke Italian with the accent of someone who had learned it where it was spoken, who had a 400-year-old map on his wall that he had collected over time. She thought about the specific quality of his patience, which was not the patience of someone who had learned to wait, but the patience of someone for whom time had a different ratio. She turned to face him fully. She said, "Luca, how old are you?" He turned to look at her. His expression was very still, the composure at maximum, and she thought, "I've asked the right question," he said. "That depends on how you're counting." She said, "Count however. You count." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her with the dark eyes that had been reading her accurately since the first Saturday, and he made a decision she could see him make, a shift in what he was choosing to show her, the stillness opening slightly to let something else through. "A long time," he said. "Much longer than I look." She stood in his apartment in front of a 400-year-old map and thought about all the things she had been cataloging for 2 months and how they assembled themselves now into a shape that was impossible and that she recognized was the correct shape. "Tell me," she said. So, he did. She had questions. Of course, she had questions. She was a project manager, which meant her professional existence was built on the identification of gaps between what was stated and what was true, and the questions came in the ordered sequence of someone who had received a significant amount of information and was processing it systematically rather than emotionally. She asked them over 2 hours, sitting in his reading chairs with coffee that had gone cold, and he answered everything without impatience, without the faint condescension of someone who had answered these questions before and found them tedious, with the same quality of complete attention he brought to everything she said. "How long, specifically, very specific about this," he said. 641 years. Give or take the imprecision of records in the earlier centuries. Where? Born. A city in what was now northern Italy, which explained the Italian with such perfect native precision. Whether he had always looked this way. No, he said. The aging stopped at the point of the change, which had occurred when he was 32, which meant he had spent 6 centuries in a 32-year-old body while the world moved around him. Whether it was painful. "Which part?" he said. "All of it," she said. "Some of it," he said, in the way of someone being honest about a complicated answer. She asked about his life in the centuries between. This was the question she was most interested in, and also the largest, and he answered it in the way she was beginning to recognize as his mode for large things. Not comprehensively, but honestly, selecting the pieces that gave the truest picture, without burying her in detail. He had lived in many cities. He had had work of various kinds. He had known people who had died. He had known people who had died across many generations of the same families, which was its own particular shape of loss. He had watched the world build and dismantle itself repeatedly, and had found, he said, that this produced eventually a strange kind of faith, not religious, but in the basic persistence of human effort towards something better, which kept being interrupted, but kept resuming. She thought about the 400-year-old maps. The books accumulated across what now revealed itself as not just a reading life, but a very long reading life. The way he moved through the world with the composure of someone for whom the world's speed was not a pressure, but a relative condition. She thought about the engagement party. She thought about 47 members of her family that he had walked into on a Saturday night because a stranger had asked him to. "Why?" she said. That was the question she kept returning to. "You could have stayed in your chair. You had no reason to help me." He looked at her steadily. "I've told you why," he said. "Tell me again." He was quiet for a moment. "I've lived a very long time," he said, "and I've found that the things worth doing are the things that are worth doing now, in the moment they present themselves, without calculating what they cost." He paused. "You asked clearly. You needed help, and you were honest about needing it." He met her eyes. "And I was curious about you." "Curious about me specifically," she said. He nodded. "You'd never seen me before." "No. But I'd been watching you on the pavement for several minutes before you crossed the street." He paused. "You were working through options one by one and discarding them, and not panicking, just methodically eliminating what didn't work and moving to the next thing. He paused again, and then when you ran out of options, you didn't panic then either. You looked up, and you crossed the street. She thought about that. It was accurate. It was the exact sequence. That told me something, he said, about how you think. He held her gaze. 600 years is enough time to know that how someone thinks when things are going wrong tells you more about them than everything else combined. She sat in his reading chair in his book-filled apartment with its 400-year-old maps and thought about what it meant to be known by someone who had been paying attention to people for 6 centuries. What it meant that his assessment of her had been made in 5 minutes and had not changed in 2 months, and she had not been able to find a moment yet where his reading of her had been inaccurate. She thought about her mother's call, and Marco and the lie, and the fact that it was now more complicated than she had originally understood. "I need to tell my family," she said. "Tell them." "What?" he said. She looked at him. "Everything," she said. He was quiet. "Not everything," she said. "The real version. That Marco isn't real. That I've been seeing someone. That his name is Luca, and I met him in a way I'll explain when I've worked out how to explain it." He nodded. She thought about Nonna Clara's hand on his arm. "Don't waste this one." "When?" he said. "Soon," she said, "before this gets any more built on something false." He nodded again. He looked at her with the dark, steady attention, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have not done this before, whatever this is." He paused. "I've been careful, for a long time, for obvious reasons, about how close I let people get." He held her gaze. "I'm not being careful with you." She sat with the weight of that. 641 years of careful, and then a woman on a pavement with a lie and a problem, and 12 contacts going to voicemail, and he had folded his newspaper and stood up. "I'm not being careful either," she said. The room was quiet around them, the warm quiet of a space that had been inhabited for a long time by someone who knew how to be still, and outside the May city moved with its ordinary beautiful noise, and she was sitting in the apartment of a 600-year-old man who had collected maps and read newspapers and walked into a room full of her family and been specifically endorsed by the most accurate person she knew. She thought, against all reason and entirely reasonably, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She told her family in June, not all of it, because not all of it was hers to tell without his permission and without a much longer conversation that they had not yet had about what could be safely disclosed and to whom. But the essential core of it, the part that was hers, Marco had never existed. She had invented him at Daniela's wedding, and she was sorry, and she understood what it meant to have organized a party around something she had fabricated. She told her mother first, on a Sunday call that she had been preparing for 2 weeks. Her mother was quiet for a very long time after the essential part, the particular silence of someone who is deciding which of several responses is the correct one. Then she said, "I knew." Mia paused. "What do you mean you knew?" Her mother made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. "Mia," she said, with the patience of a woman who had been a mother for 30 years and had extensive experience with the distance between what her daughter said and what was actually happening. "I've known you for 30 years. I know what your face looks like when you're managing something." Mia sat on her kitchen floor, which was where she had ended up during the first minute of the call, and had not moved from. "When?" she said. "Since Christmas at least," her mother said. "Possibly before." She paused. "But the man at the party, he was real." "Yes," Mia said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "He's the one you're seeing now." "Yes," Mia said. Another pause. "He was kind to your grandmother," her mother said finally, which was not the response Mia had prepared for and which, because she knew her mother, she understood was the most important thing her mother had observed and was choosing to lead with. "Yes," Mia said. "He is." Her mother sighed properly this time. "Bring him to Sunday lunch," she said, as himself, Not as Marco, as whoever he actually is. Luca, Mia said. His name is Luca. Bring Luca to Sunday lunch, her mother said. And Mia, next time you're drowning, call me before you invent a fiancé. That's what mothers are for. Mia sat on her kitchen floor and discovered, unexpectedly, that she was crying slightly. Thank you, Mama, she said. Don't thank me. Bring Luca, her mother said, and rang off. She told Daniela the next day, and Daniela said, I knew something was off with the photos, and I mean, honestly, that man was too good to be someone you met on a dating app, which was the most Daniela response possible, and landed with the specific warmth of someone who was choosing humor, because it was more loving than judgment. She told Nana Clara on a Tuesday, in person, because Nana Clara deserved in person for everything that mattered. She sat beside her grandmother in the flat she had lived in for 40 years, and told her the truth, and her grandmother listened with the accurate attention that had never once in Mia's lifetime been deceived by anything Mia had tried to conceal from her. When she finished, Nana Clara said, the man at the party. The real one. Yes, Mia said. I know, her grandmother said. I told you not to waste him. She had, Mia said. Good, Nana Clara said. Bring him for coffee. I have questions. The Sunday lunch was in July. Luca came with 2 bottles of wine, which he had chosen with the knowledge of someone who had spent time in the regions where the grapes were grown, and her father opened the first one and raised an eyebrow at the label and looked at Luca with the expression that meant the assessment had begun and was proceeding well. Her mother cooked in the way she cooked when someone she had not yet categorized was coming, which meant everything was perfect, and there was too much of it. He was himself. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the days after. He did not perform a different version of the engagement party composure. He did not modify himself for the context. He asked her father about the work he had retired from and listened with genuine interest for 20 minutes. He helped her mother carry dishes without being asked. He sat beside Nana Clara after lunch, and they spoke in Italian for half an hour, quietly, while the rest of the table had dessert, and her grandmother's expression across that half hour was the expression she wore when she was in the company of someone she considered fully worth her time. Mia watched this from across the table and thought about 600 years of living carefully, and a newspaper folded and all right, and the maps on the wall, and the quality of his attention, and how it had felt, every single time she had been in a hard moment, to have someone who did not try to fix it, but simply stayed. Her cousin Daniela appeared beside her with a piece of tiramisu. He's better as Luca, Daniela said quietly. Yes, Mia said. Daniela looked at her. You're in love with him, she said, not a question. Mia considered denying this, and then considered that Daniela had known her since childhood, and the denial would be both transparent and pointless. Yes, she said. Does he know? Daniela said. I think he knows, Mia said. I haven't said it. Daniela took a bite of tiramisu and considered. He's been looking at you all afternoon, she said, the same way he looked at you at the party. Like, you're the interesting thing in the room. She paused. He definitely knows. Mia looked across to where Luca was talking with Nana Clara and thought about a man who had been paying careful attention for 6 centuries and had decided one March morning outside a cafe to stop being careful. She thought she should probably say the thing. She said it in August, on a warm evening on the roof terrace of his building, which she had not known existed until he had taken her there in July, and which had become, across the summer, the place they came when the apartments felt too contained for the particular conversations they were having. It was the kind of evening that August produced occasionally and unreliably, the kind where the city's heat had been softened by a late afternoon rain, and everything smelled of wet stone, and the light was doing something specific and golden with the remaining hour before dark. They had been sitting in the particular comfortable quiet that she had come to think of as one of the defining qualities of being with him. The quiet that didn't need to be filled because both of them were, by temperament, people who understood that presence was its own kind of conversation. She had been thinking about how to say it for several weeks, and had arrived, through the methodical discarding of various approaches, at the conclusion that the way she said things when they were most important to her was directly, without preamble, in plain words. "I'm in love with you," she said. He turned to look at her. He was very still. The specific stillness that she now understood was not composure but attention, all of it directed at her. She held the eye contact. She said it the way she said difficult things to difficult clients, from a position of having decided, not from a position of hoping for a specific response. He reached over and took her hand. His hand was warm, she thought, which was not the thing she had expected herself to think, and then she thought that she had apparently been expecting something and had not examined the expectation closely enough. He said, "I've been in love with you since the engagement party." She looked at him. "Since before the end of it," he said. "Since your grandmother's armchair." He paused. "I've been waiting for you to arrive at it yourself, because I was not going to be the one to say it first." She thought about this. 6 months of dinners and Tuesdays and Saturdays, and conversations that lasted past restaurant closing, and a roof terrace in August, and the full weight of his attention across all of it, and he had been carrying this since March. "Why not first?" she said. "Because," he said, "you had a right to arrive at your own conclusions about an unusual situation without me adding pressure." He held her gaze. "I have time." He paused, with the particular quality of the pause that meant he was about to say something true. "I also knew you were going to get there. I've been watching you think since the calf. I know what it looks like when you've decided." She sat on the roof terrace in the August golden light and thought about a woman who had been competent and careful and managed everything, and not been known past the competence, and about a man who had seen past it in 11 minutes outside a calf, and had waited 6 months for her to finish deciding, and had not once, in all of that time, tried to manage her toward the conclusion. She leaned across and kissed him. He kissed her back with the quiet certainty he brought to everything, the same quality as the hand on her elbow in March, already certain. When she sat back, she said, "You're going to have to tell me more about what you are and what it means. For this. For whatever this is going to be." He nodded. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "There are things I need to tell you, and I've been waiting until I knew you had all the information you needed about me as a person before I added the information about my situation." He paused. "I didn't want the situation to be the thing you were deciding about." She thought about what that meant, that he had wanted her to choose him and then deal with the complications of the choice, rather than choosing the complications and him as a part of the package. She thought about 6 months of deliberate withholding in service of letting her see clearly. "Tell me," she said. So across the August evening, with the city below them doing its ordinary things, and the light going slowly gold, and then amber, and then the soft blue of coming dark, he told her. About what his life was. About the community of people like him that existed in the city, small, careful, ancient in various ways, living their extended lives in the margins of ordinary human time, about what it meant to be in this kind of relationship, the questions it raised, the decisions it eventually required. She listened the way she always listened to him, completely. When he finished, she said, "What happens to people who are with someone like you? Long term." He was quiet for a moment. "It depends on what they want," he said, "and what they choose. There are options." He was careful with the word. "I'm not presenting them now as something you need to decide. I'm telling you they exist." She thought about this, about the specific shape of a future that was currently unresolved, and the fact that she was sitting next to someone who had been navigating unresolved futures for 600 years and had not found them insurmountable. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. She leaned against him. The August evening settled around them. The city performed its ordinary motions below. She thought about a woman on a pavement with 12 voicemails and $41, and a lie she had been carrying for 11 months, and a man across the street reading a newspaper. She thought about all right and the engagement party and patient eyes and "I've been in love with you since March." She thought that the lie she had told 11 months ago at her cousin's wedding, standing with a glass of Prosecco under pressure she had not known how to resist, had turned out to be the lie that led her here. To a roof terrace in August with a 600-year-old man who had collected maps and waited 6 months for her to finish deciding and had not once tried to rush her. She thought, some lies have better endings than they deserve. The next thing she did was practical, because she was who she was, and the next thing was always practical. She made a list. The list was in her work notebook, the one she used for project tracking, because she did not believe in keeping separate systems for different kinds of problems. The list had 2 columns. The first column was headed things that are true, and it contained what she knew. She was in love with someone who had been alive for 6 centuries. This person was, in every measurable quality she had observed across 7 months, exactly who he appeared to be. The relationship was real, and she had chosen it from a position of full information. Her family, with the possible exception of Nana Clara, who she suspected knew more than she had said, did not know the full truth. There were decisions she would eventually need to make about her future that were unlike any decisions she had previously been required to make. The second column was headed things that can wait, and it contained everything from the first column that did not require immediate attention. She looked at the second column. It contained almost everything from the first column. She closed the notebook. She was good at this, she thought, the identification of what required action now and what required only the acknowledgement that it existed. Her work had taught her that the greatest inefficiency in any project was the energy spent worrying about problems that were not yet problems, the anticipatory management of futures that had not arrived and might arrive differently than imagined. This was a thing she was choosing. She was choosing it with full information. The details of how it would develop were details she would address when they arrived. She told Daniela in September. Not everything, but enough. Enough that Daniela sat across from her at the narrow restaurant with the mismatched chairs and was quiet for a long time in a way that Daniela almost never was. Then she said how old. Old, Mia said. Like older than us old, or like actually old? Like the maps on his wall old, Mia said. Daniela sat with this. She picked up her wine glass and put it down without drinking from it. The thing at the party, she said, when he seemed like he'd done it before. Many times. He has, Mia said. Daniela was quiet again. Is he good to you? She said, which was the same question Mia's mother had asked about Marco, and which Mia understood was the question the women in her family asked when they were cutting to what actually mattered. Yes, Mia said. Do you trust him? Yes. Does he make you happy? Mia thought about Saturdays and Tuesdays and a roof terrace in August and the specific quality of being known past the competence. Yes, she said. More than I knew to expect. Daniela nodded slowly. Then, the rest is details, she said. Hard details, probably, but details. Mia looked at her cousin. You're not going to ask me if I'm sure. You've made exactly 3 impulsive decisions in your life, Daniela said. The Prosecco at my wedding and me, I'd argue the dress you wore to your graduation. She paused. This isn't impulsive. No, Mia said. It isn't. She had been building it carefully for 7 months without knowing, at the beginning, that there was anything to build. She had made the list, and the list told her what she had already known, that the complicated parts were real, and the significant parts were more real than the complicated parts, and that she was, with the methodical deliberateness of someone who had eliminated the alternatives, not going anywhere. She told Luca about the list. He listened with the expression she associated with things he found both accurate and surprising, the reading expression doing something additional, something warmer. You made a project plan, he said. It helped clarify, she said. He looked at her for a moment. I've been alive for 600 years, he said, and I've never had anyone respond to learning what I am by making a project plan. Is that good or bad? She said. He smiled, the specific rare smile that she had been collecting since she first saw it, the one that came from somewhere genuine rather than being assembled for the occasion. It's very you, he said, which she understood was his way of saying it was both. October brought the first sustained cold, and she began spending more time at his apartment, the natural migration toward warmth, and the specifically warm quality of his space, the books and the maps, and the inhabited quality of rooms that had been lived in deliberately, rather than occupied in transit. She brought things slowly, the accumulation of small installations. A second toothbrush, a book she was reading that she had started there and wanted to continue there, a coffee mug she preferred to the ones he had. He watched these arrivals without comment. She noticed him watching, and knew, from 7 months of reading his expressions, that the watching was not neutral. It was the quality of attention he brought to things he valued, the complete unhurried focus of someone who understood that the small things built the large things, and intended to be present for both. One evening she came in from work to find a shelf had been cleared in the sitting room. Not a prominent shelf, not a statement, just a practical space at a comfortable height. Empty, waiting, she stood in front of it for a moment. She came to find him in the kitchen. For your things, he said, without turning around from what he was doing. So they're not stacked on the floor. She stood in the kitchen doorway and thought about a cleared shelf and what it meant when a 600-year-old man who had been living carefully for longer than most of her family's country had been a country cleared a shelf for you. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone has decided. Thank you, she said. He turned to look at her, the dark eyes, steady and warm and very sure. Of course, he said. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her with the cool, certain steadiness she had been returning to since March. And she thought, I crossed the street for a fiancé, and I found something I didn't know I was looking for. And the looking for it had started before the street, before the Prosecco, before the lie, in some much earlier version of herself who had been waiting for someone to see past the competence and stay. He had stayed. From the first Saturday. He had never left. The winter came back around to March, completing the year, and Mia stood in a different context than she had occupied 1 year ago, but in the same city, and with the same quality of problem-solving attention that had taken her across a street to a man with a newspaper. And she thought about the distance between the two marches and found it both enormous and, in some essential way she couldn't fully articulate, continuous. She had always been herself. That was what the year had shown her, looking back. The woman who had told a lie under pressure, and the woman who had managed it badly, and the woman who had crossed a street with a request she had no real right to make, and the woman who had made a list with 2 columns. Those were all the same woman. Working with the available materials, keeping moving when things were hard, crossing to the next point of possibility when the current ground ran out. The difference was that she was no longer the only one working with the materials. She had a meeting at the architecture firm in the morning about the structural decision that had been reconsidered the previous March, which had since been resolved in the sequence she had identified at that Tuesday dinner, 3 months late, but resolved cleanly and at lower cost than the contractor had projected. She had won the argument by being right about the sequence, and she had been right about the sequence because she had talked through the one unresolved variable with someone who asked the single necessary question. She thought about this sometimes, about the particular value of someone who could find the one thing you hadn't resolved and point to it without making it into anything. She had lunch with Daniela on Wednesdays now, a habit they had built across the year from occasional coffees into something regular and necessary. She had told Daniela more over the months, in pieces, and Daniela had absorbed each piece with the specific quality of someone who loved her enough to meet her where she actually was, rather than where it was easier to imagine her being. Daniela asked smart questions. She did not panic. She was, Mia thought, someone who had married well, and understood therefore what it looked like when something was genuine, even when the genuine thing came in a form that was unusual. Her mother had met Luca at Sunday lunch 4 more times. Her father had taken him to a football match in November, which had been Luca's idea, and which had produced, according to her father's report, the finest 3 hours of company he had had in a long time. Because Luca had watched the match with the specific focused intelligence he brought to everything, and had observed, accurately, 2 strategic decisions in the second half that her father had also observed, and had apparently spent 20 years unable to get anyone else in the family to engage with. Her mother had watched Luca at the Sunday table in December, and had said to Mia in the kitchen afterward that he looked at her the way her father had looked at her when they were 30, which her mother said with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone whose most important criterion had been met. Nonna Clara had said, in February, after the long Italian conversation on the sofa that was now a fixture of every visit, that he was a man who understood patience. She had said this with the authority of someone who had been paying attention for 81 years, and had seen enough of what patience produced and what its absence cost. He does, Mia had said. Good, her grandmother had said. Patience is the thing that makes everything else possible. She had looked at Mia with the accurate eyes. You have it too, you know. More than you give yourself credit for. Mia had thought about 11 months of sustained crisis management and a list with 2 columns, and 7 months of arriving at a conclusion without being rushed toward it. I'm learning, she had said. The question that was still on the list, that had remained in the things that can wait column for as long as she could responsibly leave it there, was the one about her future. The specific shape of it. The decision that was unlike the decisions she had previously been required to make. She had read things and asked careful questions, and done the research in the way she did research, systematically and without panic. And she had arrived at a place that was not yet a decision, but was the place you stood before a decision when you were a person who needed to know the full terrain before you committed to a direction. She asked him about it on the roof terrace in the first week of March, when the air was still cold, but the worst of winter was technically over, which felt like the right context, the year completing its circle, the starting place returned to from a different angle. She said, I've been thinking about the list. He looked at her. Column 1 or column 2, he said, which meant he remembered the columns from the October conversation, which she had not found surprising. Column 2, she said, the things that were waiting. He nodded. He was still, the complete attention. She said, I want to talk about what comes next, not as a decision I've made, as a conversation I want to have with you. He turned to face her fully. All right, he said, and the 2 words arrived with the same quality they had carried 1 year ago outside the caf, simple and complete and entirely committed, the quality of someone who had never once in 12 months been anything other than entirely present. She thought about all right on a March pavement, and all right on a roof terrace, and the 12 months between them and the distance traveled, and the fact that the quality of the all right was exactly the same. Steady, certain, already there. She took his hand. They talked for a long time, about the options, and what they meant, and what she understood, and what she needed to understand better, and what she wanted, which she was clearer about now than she had been in October, the column 2 things having done their waiting and arrived ready. He answered everything. He offered nothing she hadn't asked for, and withheld nothing she had. He was, as he had been since the first Saturday, precisely the person she had found him to be. No variance, no accumulated disappointments, just the same quality of full presence and honest engagement that had taken her across a street in the first place. It was not, she understood, a decision she was going to make tonight, or this week, or perhaps for some time. But she understood the terrain now. She She knew what she was choosing toward, and she knew, with the methodical certainty of someone who had been eliminating alternatives for a year, that she was choosing toward it. "I'm not saying yes tonight," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "But I'm not saying no." The expression that moved through his face was the expression she had been collecting all year, the rare one that was not composure, but something beneath it, something that had been waiting longer than she had been alive, and was finally, carefully, being allowed to surface. "That's enough," he said. More than enough. The March city moved below them, with its ordinary indifferent motion, beginning the year again as it always did, without awareness of what was happening on a rooftop above it, where a woman who had crossed a street with a lie and found the truest thing she had ever chosen was sitting with the man who had folded a newspaper and said all right, and then never, in all the months and conversations and Sunday lunches and cleared shelves and ordinary warm evenings that followed, had left. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. The city below them did its city things. The year turned. She thought about all the useful lies she had ever told and concluded that only one of them had been worth the telling, and that the thing it had given her was sitting beside her on a rooftop in March, with his arm around her and his patience intact, and his all right still ringing, a year later, with the same exact quality of certainty it had carried outside a cafe when he had folded a newspaper and stood up and walked into the rest of her life. She did not let go. He did not leave.